My name is Margaret Whitfield. I'm 68 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I stood in the back of St. Catherine's Cathedral, watching my son's wedding rehearsal fall apart in the most spectacular way imaginable. You see, his fiancée had banned me from attending the rehearsal dinner, claiming I was too controlling and needed to learn boundaries. But what she didn't know was that while she was playing the perfect bride-to-be, I had already discovered her devastating secret. She was already married. To another man. And when I walked into that church and whispered the truth to Father Morrison, everything she had carefully constructed came crashing down in front of 40 wedding guests, 2 families, and one very shocked groom. This is the story of how I saved my son from the biggest mistake of his life, and how sometimes a mother's intuition is the only thing standing between love and complete disaster. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My late husband Robert and I raised our son Daniel with strong values and an unshakable belief in honesty. Robert passed away 5 years ago after a brief battle with cancer, and since then, Daniel and I have grown even closer. He's 34 now, a successful architect who designs sustainable housing projects for low-income communities. He's always been the kind of man who puts others first, sometimes to his own detriment. After Robert died, Daniel made sure I was never alone for holidays, called me every evening, and even moved back to our hometown of Millbrook, Vermont, specifically to be closer to me. Daniel had been single for almost 3 years when he met Cassandra. His previous relationship had ended badly when his ex-fiancée cheated on him, and it took him a long time to trust again. I watched my son struggle with loneliness and self-doubt, wondering if he'd ever find someone who truly appreciated his gentle nature and generous heart. When he finally started dating again, I was hopeful but cautious. I wanted him to find love, but I also wanted to protect him from another heartbreak. Our family has deep roots in this community. Robert's family had been in Millbrook for 4 generations, running the local hardware store until Robert sold it to pursue teaching. I worked as the head librarian at Millbrook Elementary for 32 years, watching 3 generations of children grow up. We knew everyone in town, and everyone knew us. Our reputation was built on decades of honesty, community service, and treating people with respect. This background becomes important later, because when you've lived somewhere your entire life, you develop a sense for when something doesn't quite fit. When Daniel first started talking about Cassandra, I noticed an immediate change in him. He had this light in his eyes that I hadn't seen since before his father's death. He would spend hours on the phone with her, laughing in a way that reminded me of the boy he used to be. He started dressing differently, paying more attention to his appearance, and he seemed to have more energy than he'd had in years. As his mother, seeing him happy again was everything I could have hoped for. Cassandra lived in Burlington, about an hour away, where she claimed to work as a marketing consultant for small businesses. Daniel would drive up there every weekend, and occasionally she'd come to Millbrook. At first, I was thrilled that he'd found someone who seemed to bring out the best in him. He talked about her constantly, telling me about her intelligence, her ambition, and her sophisticated taste in everything from wine to art to literature. But there were small things that struck me as odd from the very beginning. Daniel had always been the type to introduce his girlfriends to me relatively quickly. He valued my opinion and wanted the important people in his life to know each other. With Cassandra, though, it took nearly 3 months before I actually met her. When I asked Daniel about it, he said she was nervous about meeting me because she'd heard so much about our close relationship and wanted to make a perfect first impression. When I finally did meet Cassandra, I understood why Daniel was so smitten. She was absolutely stunning, with long auburn hair, striking green eyes, and the kind of polished appearance that suggested she spent considerable time and money on her looks. She dressed expensively, carried designer handbags, and spoke with a slight accent that she claimed was from spending summers in France as a child. Everything about her seemed designed to impress, and it was clear that Daniel was completely under her spell. Our first dinner together was at Millbrook's nicest restaurant, a small farm-to-table place called Harvest Moon. Cassandra arrived 20 minutes late, apologizing profusely and explaining that she'd had an emergency client call that ran longer than expected. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people in Millbrook spent on clothing in a year, and she seemed genuinely surprised by the restaurant's rustic charm. Throughout dinner, Cassandra dominated the conversation, telling elaborate stories about her work with high-profile clients and her travels to various European cities. She name-dropped expensive hotels, exclusive restaurants, and designer brands with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to luxury. Daniel hung on her every word, clearly proud to be with someone so worldly and sophisticated, but something about her stories felt rehearsed, like she'd told them many times before. She spoke about Paris with great authority, describing specific neighborhoods and restaurants, but when I mentioned that my sister had lived there for 2 years and asked about a particular district, Cassandra's response was vague and evasive. Similarly, when she talked about her marketing work, she used a lot of business jargon, but never provided concrete details about actual projects or results. What bothered me most was how she seemed to study my reactions to everything she said. When she mentioned her expensive tastes, she watched my face carefully, as if gauging whether I was impressed or concerned. When she talked about her ambitious career goals, she seemed to be testing whether I thought she was good enough for Daniel. There was a calculating quality to her charm that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The evening ended pleasantly enough, with Cassandra complimenting the restaurant and suggesting that we should do this more often. But as I watched her say goodbye to Daniel, I noticed that her demeanor changed the moment she thought I wasn't looking. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by something cooler and more distant. It was just a flash, but it was enough to plant the first seed of doubt in my mind. Over the next few months, I began to notice patterns in Cassandra's behavior that concerned me. She had an unusual relationship with technology for someone who claimed to work in marketing. Her phone was always face down during dinner. She never took business calls when I was around. And when Daniel mentioned her social media presence, she claimed to keep a low profile online for professional reasons. More troubling was how she seemed to discourage Daniel from talking about his life in Millbrook. When he mentioned community, events, local friends, or family traditions, she would quickly change the subject or make subtle comments about small-town limitations. She frequently suggested that Daniel was too talented for a place like Millbrook and should consider opportunities in larger cities where his architectural skills would be more appreciated. Cassandra also had peculiar gaps in her personal history. When I asked about her family, she provided only vague details about parents who were traveling extensively in retirement and siblings who lived scattered across the country. She never showed photos of family gatherings, never mentioned childhood friends, and seemed to have no lasting connections with anyone from her past. For someone in her early 30s, this seemed unusual. Her financial situation was another puzzle. She claimed to work as a freelance consultant, which should have meant irregular income, yet she always had money for expensive clothes, jewelry, and dining. When Daniel mentioned that she'd paid for their weekend getaway to a luxury resort in the mountains, I wondered how a freelance consultant could afford such extravagances. Daniel, who had always been practical about money, seemed completely unconcerned about these disparities. Most concerning was how Cassandra began to subtly isolate Daniel from his usual social circle. She would find excuses to avoid gatherings with his longtime friends, claiming work obligations or mild illnesses. When his friends invited them to casual get-togethers, she would suggest alternative plans that involved just the two of them. Gradually, Daniel began seeing less of the people who had been important to him for years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 6 months after they started dating, Daniel called me with exciting news. He was planning to propose to Cassandra during a weekend trip to Boston where she had suggested they visit art galleries and fine restaurants. He had already purchased a ring, a beautiful vintage piece that had belonged to his grandmother, and he was nervous but confident that Cassandra would say yes. The proposal itself went exactly as Daniel had hoped. He arranged for a private dinner at an upscale restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor, and when he got down on one knee, Cassandra's reaction was everything he'd dreamed of. She cried. She said yes enthusiastically, and they spent the rest of the weekend celebrating and planning their future together. When they returned to Millbrook and announced their engagement, I did my best to share Daniel's joy. Cassandra seemed genuinely happy, showing off the ring to everyone we encountered and talking excitedly about wedding plans. She hugged me warmly and said she was thrilled to officially be joining our family. For a moment, I wondered if my previous concerns had been unfounded, if I'd been looking for problems where none existed. But even during the engagement celebration, there were small details that bothered me. When people asked about wedding plans, Cassandra immediately began talking about venues in Burlington or even Boston, dismissing the idea of a local ceremony. When Daniel mentioned that his father had always hoped he'd get married at St. Catherine's Cathedral, where our family had worshipped for generations, Cassandra's smile became forced and she said they needed to explore all options. She also seemed unusually eager to set a quick wedding date. When Daniel suggested a timeline of 12 to 18 months to properly plan everything, Cassandra pushed for something much sooner. She claimed that her work schedule would be more flexible in the early spring, and she didn't want to postpone their happiness any longer than necessary. Her urgency struck me as odd, but Daniel was so happy that he readily agreed to whatever timeline she preferred. That evening, after the celebration dinner, I lay awake thinking about my new future daughter-in-law. I wanted to love her for Daniel's sake, and I genuinely hoped that my instincts were wrong. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Cassandra was hiding something significant. The pieces of her life didn't fit together quite right, and her behavior toward Daniel felt more like performance than genuine affection. I told myself that perhaps I was being overprotective, that no woman would ever seem good enough for my son. But as the weeks passed and wedding planning began in earnest, my concerns would only grow stronger. The morning after Daniel and Cassandra's engagement announcement, my phone rang at 7:30. It was Cassandra, calling with an energy level that seemed almost manic for such an early hour. She was already deep into wedding planning mode, having apparently spent the entire night researching venues, caterers, and photographers. What struck me immediately was how everything she described was elaborate, expensive, and completely at odds with the kind of celebration Daniel had always imagined for himself. Cassandra had compiled a list of potential venues that read like, a tour of New England's most exclusive properties, the Shelburne Farms Mansion in Vermont, with its sweeping lake views and $15,000 venue fee, the Ocean House in Rhode Island, where the ceremony alone would cost more than most people's annual salary, the Chandler at Cliff Walk in Newport, where she claimed to have connections that could secure a discount, though she was vague about the nature of these connections. When I gently suggested that these seemed quite expensive, Cassandra laughed and said that a wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event that deserved to be truly special. But it wasn't just the cost that concerned me. Every detail of Cassandra's vision seemed designed to impress strangers rather than celebrate the couple's actual relationship. She wanted a string quartet during the ceremony, a jazz band for cocktails, and a full orchestra for dancing. She described flowers that would need to be flown in from specialty growers in Holland, wines that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week, and a photographer whose portfolio included celebrity weddings and European royalty. When I asked about incorporating any family traditions or personal touches that reflected their relationship, Cassandra's response was telling. She said that traditional elements were charming in small towns, but would seem provincial at the kind of sophisticated celebration she was planning. She wanted everything to reflect what she called their new life together, rather than being weighed down by old-fashioned customs that might not photograph well for their wedding album. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Cassandra outlined every aspect of her dream wedding in meticulous detail. She had researched makeup artists who worked with fashion models, hairstylists who had styled hair for movie premieres, and even a company that specialized in transporting exotic flowers via climate-controlled vehicles. The level of planning was impressive, but it felt more like she was organizing a corporate event than celebrating a marriage. When I asked Daniel privately what he thought about these elaborate plans, he seemed overwhelmed but reluctant to voice any objections. He told me that Cassandra had very specific ideas about what their wedding should represent, and he didn't want to disappoint her by suggesting something smaller or more modest. He admitted that the costs were concerning, but Cassandra had assured him that her family would contribute significantly, and they could always take out a loan for the remainder. This conversation troubled me deeply. Daniel had always been practical about money, having learned from his father's example the importance of living within one's means. The idea that he would go into debt for a single day's celebration seemed completely contrary to his usual values. But when I tried to express these concerns, Daniel became defensive, saying that I didn't understand how important this was to Cassandra, and asking me to trust his judgment. The first major conflict arose over the guest list, and it revealed a side of Cassandra that she had previously kept hidden. Daniel had assumed that their wedding would include the usual mix of family and friends that characterizes most celebrations in small communities like ours. He wanted to invite his childhood friends, colleagues from work, neighbors who had known him since he was young, and the extended family members who had been part of his life for decades. Cassandra, however, had very different ideas about who should attend their wedding. She presented Daniel with a carefully curated list that excluded most of the people who mattered to him. His college roommate Mike, who had been his best friend for 15 years, was deemed not sophisticated enough for the type of celebration she envisioned. His cousin Sarah, who had helped him through his father's death, was dismissed as too provincial. Even Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor who had been like a second grandmother to Daniel, was considered inappropriate for what Cassandra called our elegant event. When Daniel protested that these people were important to him, Cassandra explained that she had worked hard to secure a venue that reflected their status as successful professionals, and she couldn't risk having guests who might not understand the proper etiquette for such an occasion. She suggested that they could celebrate with his local friends at a separate, more casual gathering after the honeymoon. The argument escalated when Cassandra began categorizing Daniel's friends and family members according to what she called their social compatibility with her vision. She created an actual spreadsheet, color-coding people based on their perceived sophistication, financial status, and ability to enhance the wedding experience. Green for people she considered acceptable, yellow for those who were questionable, and red for those who were absolutely excluded. Seeing my son's friends and family reduced to a color-coded chart was heartbreaking. These were people who had loved and supported Daniel through every important moment of his life. Mike had been the best man at Daniel's college graduation party. Sarah had driven 6 hours to be with him during Robert's funeral. Mrs. Henderson had brought him homemade soup every week when he was recovering from a skiing accident 3 years earlier. But Cassandra's reasoning for each exclusion was presented with such confidence that Daniel began to doubt his own judgment. When he defended Mike's inclusion, Cassandra pointed out that Mike worked in construction and might not be comfortable in a formal dining environment. When he insisted on inviting Sarah, Cassandra suggested that having too many family members would make the celebration feel insular, rather than celebratory of their new life together. The conversation grew heated when Daniel insisted that I be included in all wedding planning discussions. Cassandra's response was swift and cutting. She informed Daniel that while she respected me as his mother, she needed to establish boundaries about my involvement in their married life. She claimed that many marriages failed because mothers-in-law were too controlling, and she wanted to start their relationship on the right foot by making it clear that major decisions would be made by the couple alone. I watched Daniel's face during this exchange, and I could see him struggling between his loyalty to me and his desire to please his fiancée. Cassandra's tone was reasonable, even sympathetic, as she explained that she understood how difficult it must be for me to let go of my son. But her words carried an unmistakable message. I was being relegated to the role of distant observer in my own son's life. What bothered me most was how Cassandra framed every objection as evidence of small-minded thinking or resistance to change. When Daniel mentioned that he'd always dreamed of getting married in his hometown church, she suggested that he was limiting himself to familiar surroundings instead of embracing new possibilities. When he worried about the cost of her proposed celebration, she implied that he was being cheap rather than romantic. Cassandra insisted on hiring a professional wedding planner, despite the fact that she seemed to have very specific ideas about every aspect of the celebration. She claimed that coordinating such an elaborate event required expert assistance, and she had researched several high-end planners who specialized in luxury weddings. The planner she selected, Monica Steinberg, had organized weddings for politicians, celebrities, and wealthy business executives. The initial meeting with Monica took place at her upscale office in Burlington, where the walls were covered with photographs of elaborate celebrations in exotic locations. Cassandra arrived with a 3-ring binder containing magazine clippings, fabric samples, and detailed notes about her vision. She presented her ideas with the confidence of someone who had been planning weddings professionally for years. But as the meeting progressed, I began to notice inconsistencies in Cassandra's presentation. When Monica asked about specific vendors or venues that Cassandra claimed to have researched, her responses were often vague or contradictory. She would mention a florist she'd supposedly worked with on another event, but when Monica asked for contact information, Cassandra would claim that the florist was very exclusive and difficult to reach. Even more concerning was how Cassandra responded to Monica's professional suggestions. When Monica recommended modifications to the timeline or budget based on her experience, Cassandra became defensive and insisted that her original plan was superior. She seemed to view Monica not as an expert whose guidance she valued, but as an employee whose job was to execute her vision without question. During one particularly uncomfortable exchange, Monica asked about Cassandra's previous experience with event planning, noting that her level of detail suggested professional background. Cassandra claimed to have helped organize several high-profile events through her marketing work. But when Monica asked for specifics, Cassandra became evasive and quickly changed the subject. The meeting took an even stranger turn when Monica asked about Cassandra's family's involvement in the wedding planning. Cassandra's response was that her parents were traveling extensively and would be unable to participate in the planning process. When Monica suggested that this might complicate coordination, especially for a destination-style wedding, Cassandra became agitated and insisted that she was perfectly capable of representing her family's interests. What struck me most was how differently Cassandra behaved when Daniel was present versus when he stepped out to take a phone call. When my son was in the room, she was charming, collaborative, and deferential to his opinions. But the moment he left, her entire demeanor changed. She became imperious, impatient, and dismissive of Monica's professional expertise. As we left that meeting, Monica pulled me aside and made a comment that stayed with me for weeks. She said that in 15 years of wedding planning, she had never encountered a bride who seemed more interested in impressing strangers than in celebrating her relationship with her groom. She also mentioned that Cassandra's behavior reminded her of clients who were planning events for business or social advancement, rather than personal celebration. 2 weeks later, Cassandra announced that she wanted to go wedding dress shopping and had made appointments at several high-end boutiques in Boston. She had specifically requested that I not be included in this expedition, explaining to Daniel that she wanted to surprise everyone with her choice. This struck me as unusual, since most brides-to-be in our community traditionally included their future mothers-in-law in dress selection, but I decided not to make an issue of it. However, fate intervened when my friend Patricia, who lived in Boston, called to tell me she'd had an interesting encounter. Patricia worked part-time at an upscale bridal salon in the Back Bay area, and she'd witnessed something that she felt I should know about. A young woman matching Cassandra's description had come into the salon with another woman, claiming to be shopping for wedding dresses. But what struck Patricia as odd was how the companion repeatedly referred to the bride-to-be by a different name. According to Patricia, the woman who looked exactly like Cassandra had been addressed as Victoria throughout the appointment. When Patricia discreetly asked about the discrepancy, thinking perhaps she'd misheard, the companion quickly explained that Victoria was a nickname used by close family members. But Patricia, who had worked in customer service for 30 years, noted that the woman seemed uncomfortable with this explanation and quickly steered the conversation in a different direction. Even more puzzling was the bride's behavior during the appointment. Instead of showing the excitement typical of women choosing their wedding dress, she seemed distracted and anxious. She tried on several gowns, but seemed more interested in how quickly the alterations could be completed than in finding the perfect dress. When asked about her wedding date, she gave a vague response about sometime in the spring and seemed reluctant to provide specific details. The companion, who appeared to be in her 50s and shared some facial features with the bride, was equally evasive when asked about wedding details. When Patricia mentioned that they offered services for destination weddings, the older woman quickly said that they were keeping the location flexible and might not decide until closer to the date. What concerned Patricia most was the bride's reaction when she was asked to provide contact information for follow-up appointments. The woman who looked like Cassandra hesitated for several seconds before providing a phone number and email address, and Patricia noticed that she seemed to be calculating her response rather than simply sharing information. Patricia's instincts told her that something wasn't quite right about the entire interaction. The woman was clearly beautiful and well-dressed, but there was a quality about her behavior that suggested she was playing a role rather than genuinely shopping for her own wedding. Patricia had seen hundreds of brides over the years, and this woman's demeanor was unlike anything she'd encountered before. When Patricia shared this story with me, I felt a chill run down my spine. The possibility that Cassandra might be using a different name was deeply troubling, but I couldn't understand why she would need to do so. I considered the possibility that Patricia had simply encountered someone who resembled Cassandra, but the details were too specific to dismiss easily. The situation became even more complicated when Cassandra returned from her shopping trip with enthusiastic stories about the dresses she'd tried on. She described her experience at several boutiques, including the one where Patricia worked, but her account of the visit didn't match what Patricia had observed. Cassandra claimed to have gone alone, saying that she'd wanted to have a private, contemplative experience while choosing her dress. As wedding planning progressed, I became increasingly concerned about the financial arrangements that Cassandra was making. She had convinced Daniel to open a joint credit account specifically for wedding expenses, claiming that it would be easier to track their spending if everything went through a single source. Daniel, who had always been meticulous about his finances, agreed to this arrangement without fully understanding the implications. Within a few weeks, charges began appearing on this account that seemed excessive even by Cassandra's standards. A $3,000 payment to a florist for a consultation fee, a $2,500 deposit to a photographer whose work I'd never seen, multiple charges to luxury hotels in different cities, allegedly for venue visits that Daniel wasn't attending, a $1,800 payment to a company called Exclusive Event Solutions that Daniel had never heard of. When I asked Daniel about these expenses, he seemed surprised by some of them and promised to discuss the details with Cassandra. But when Daniel brought up his concerns with his fiancée, her response was both defensive and manipulative. She accused him of not trusting her judgment and suggested that his questioning of her decisions was a sign that he wasn't truly committed to their marriage. Cassandra's explanation for each expense was plausible, but difficult to verify. The florist consultation fee was supposedly for a preliminary design session that would be credited toward their final order. The photographer deposit was to secure his services for their preferred date, even though they hadn't seen his portfolio. The hotel charges were for venue visits that she claimed were necessary to make informed decisions about their celebration. But when I tried to verify some of these expenses by contacting the vendors directly, I encountered a series of confusing responses. The florist claimed to have no record of a consultation with anyone named Cassandra. The photographer's assistant said they didn't typically require deposits without signed contracts. Several of the hotels had no record of visits or inquiries from anyone matching Cassandra's description. More troubling was Cassandra's suggestion that Daniel should liquidate some of his retirement savings to cover the wedding expenses. She argued that they were both young enough to rebuild their savings over time and that the wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to celebrate their love in a truly memorable way. She even suggested that they could use some of the wedding gifts to replenish their emergency fund after the honeymoon. This conversation represented a fundamental shift in Daniel's financial thinking, and I could see how Cassandra's influence was changing his perspective on money and responsibility. Daniel had always been the type of person who saved first and spent later, who believed in living within his means and planning for the future. But Cassandra's approach was exactly the opposite. Spend first, worry about the consequences later. When I tried to express my concerns about this financial strategy, both Daniel and Cassandra accused me of being overly conservative and unwilling to embrace the reality that modern weddings required significant investment. Cassandra suggested that my generation didn't understand the social expectations that young professionals faced, and that a modest wedding would actually hurt Daniel's career prospects by suggesting that he wasn't successful enough to afford a proper celebration. The final straw came when I discovered that Cassandra had been making purchases using Daniel's credit card without his knowledge. When I brought this to his attention, showing him charges for expensive jewelry, spa treatments, and designer clothing, Daniel was initially shocked. But when he confronted Cassandra, she explained that these were pre-wedding investments in looking her best for their celebration, and that she'd planned to discuss them with him when the time was right. Her manipulation was so subtle and effective that Daniel began to doubt his own reactions to these financial irregularities. Cassandra would frame every concern as evidence of his lack of trust in her, his inability to understand the complexities of wedding planning, or his unwillingness to invest in their shared future. By the end of these conversations, Daniel would apologize for questioning her decisions and promise to be more supportive of her efforts. The moment that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late February. Daniel had invited me for lunch at our usual spot, Murphy's Diner on Main Street, where we'd been meeting monthly since his father passed away. These lunches had always been our special time together, a chance to catch up without distractions, and maintain the close bond we'd shared throughout his life. But this particular lunch felt different from the moment Daniel walked through the door. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that I hadn't seen since his father's illness. When I asked how the wedding planning was progressing, Daniel's response was telling. Instead of the enthusiasm he'd shown in previous weeks, he seemed overwhelmed and confused. He told me that Cassandra had been working 18-hour days on wedding preparations, making calls at all hours and becoming increasingly agitated when vendors didn't respond immediately to her requests. What concerned me most was Daniel's description of Cassandra's recent behavior at home. She had become secretive about her phone conversations, often stepping outside or into another room when calls came in. She'd started receiving packages at their apartment that she claimed were wedding-related, but she wouldn't let Daniel see the contents. When he asked about these mysterious deliveries, she became defensive and accused him of not trusting her judgment. Daniel also mentioned that Cassandra had been having frequent conversations with someone she referred to only as my cousin from California. These calls usually lasted for hours and often left Cassandra emotional and distracted. When Daniel asked about meeting this cousin, who was supposedly helping with some aspect of the wedding planning, Cassandra said that her relative was very private and preferred to work behind the scenes. But the detail that alarmed me most was Daniel's revelation that Cassandra had begun pressuring him to make significant changes to his life beyond just the wedding celebration. She'd suggested that he should consider relocating his architectural practice to a larger city where he could work with more prestigious clients. She'd also hinted that his close relationships with longtime friends and family members might be holding him back from achieving his full potential. During our lunch, Daniel looked across the table at me with an expression I'd never seen before. He seemed lost, caught between his love for Cassandra and his growing uncertainty about the direction his life was taking. He asked me directly whether I thought he was making the right decision in marrying her, and I could hear the doubt in his voice even as he tried to sound confident about their relationship. This was the moment I realized that my son needed help, even if he couldn't bring himself to ask for it directly. Something was seriously wrong with Cassandra's behavior, and the inconsistencies I'd been noticing were adding up to a pattern that I could no longer ignore. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly who Cassandra really was. That evening, I began what would become the most thorough investigation I'd ever conducted in my life. As a former librarian, I'd always been skilled at research, but investigating a real person with potentially deceptive intentions was unlike anything I'd ever attempted before. I started with the most basic searches, looking for any online presence that could give me insight into Cassandra's background and history. Cassandra's social media presence was surprisingly limited for someone of her generation. Her Instagram account contained only about 30 photos, all posted within the last 8 months, and most of them showed her in various upscale locations around Vermont and nearby states. What struck me as odd was that none of the photos showed her with friends or family members. Every image was either a selfie or a picture of her with Daniel, with no evidence of the social connections that most people her age would have accumulated over the years. Her LinkedIn profile was equally sparse, listing only her current position as a marketing consultant and her education at a university in California. When I tried to verify her educational background by calling the alumni office, I encountered the first of many dead ends. The university had no record of anyone by her name graduating with the degree she claimed to have earned. When I pressed for more information, the registrar's office suggested that perhaps she had attended under a different name or had changed her name after graduation. This discovery sent a chill down my spine. If Cassandra wasn't using her real name, it would explain why so many aspects of her background seemed impossible to verify. I began searching for variations of her name, different spellings, and possible maiden names, but each search led to more questions than answers. The breakthrough came when I decided to search for the phone number Cassandra had given us when she and Daniel first started dating. Using a reverse phone lookup service, I discovered that the number was registered to someone named Victoria Chen, not Cassandra. When I cross-referenced this name with the address associated with the phone number, I found records of a woman who matched Cassandra's age and description, but with a completely different personal history. Victoria Chen had been married 4 years earlier to a man named Marcus Thompson in a ceremony that took place in Riverside, California. According to public records, the marriage was still legally valid, with no record of divorce proceedings or annulment. The wedding announcement in the local newspaper described Victoria as a marketing coordinator for a small advertising firm and included a photograph that was unmistakably the woman I knew as Cassandra. This discovery left me reeling. If these records were accurate, then Cassandra was already married to another man, which would make her engagement to Daniel not just deceptive, but potentially criminal. I spent the rest of the evening verifying these findings through multiple sources, hoping against hope that I had made an error or that there was an innocent explanation for the discrepancy. But every piece of evidence I uncovered supported the same shocking conclusion. The woman my son was planning to marry was living under a false identity and was already legally married to someone else. The question that tormented me through a sleepless night was how to handle this information without destroying Daniel's life in the process. The next morning, I made a decision that I knew was risky but necessary. I was going to contact Marcus Thompson directly and try to understand exactly what kind of situation Daniel had become involved in. Using the contact information I'd found in the public records, I called the number listed for Marcus Thompson, not knowing what I would say, or how he might react to questions about his wife. Marcus answered on the third ring, and his voice was warm and friendly as he said hello. When I explained that I was calling about Victoria Chen, there was a long pause before he asked how I knew his wife. I decided to be direct, telling him that his wife was currently engaged to my son under the name Cassandra and was planning to marry him in a few months. The silence that followed was deafening. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told me that Victoria had disappeared from their home in California 6 months earlier, leaving only a note saying that she needed time to figure things out and would contact him when she was ready. He'd been hoping that she would come back, and he'd had no idea that she was living under a different name or involved with another man. Marcus's story painted a picture of a woman who had been living a double life for much longer than just her time with Daniel. According to her husband, Victoria had always been secretive about her past, claiming that she'd grown up in foster care and had no family connections. She'd been evasive about her work history and had frequently disappeared for days at a time, claiming to be visiting clients or attending business conferences that he was never allowed to accompany her to. The marriage had been troubled from the beginning, with Victoria displaying increasingly erratic behavior and making financial decisions that left them deeply in debt. She'd opened credit accounts without Marcus's knowledge, made large purchases that she couldn't explain, and had been in contact with people she refused to identify. When Marcus had tried to address these issues, Victoria would become defensive and accuse him of being controlling and paranoid. The final months of their marriage had been particularly difficult, with Victoria becoming increasingly agitated and secretive. She'd started receiving phone calls at all hours that she would take in private, and she'd begun talking about needing to start fresh somewhere new. Marcus had suggested counseling, but Victoria had refused, saying that their problems were temporary and would resolve themselves once she'd handled some unspecified business matters. When Victoria disappeared, she'd taken most of their savings and had left Marcus with thousands of dollars in debt from credit cards he didn't know existed. He'd filed a missing person report, but the police had told him that since Victoria was an adult who had left voluntarily, there was little they could do unless evidence of foul play emerged. Marcus's revelations confirmed my worst fears about Cassandra's character and intentions. She was clearly someone who used deception and manipulation to take advantage of trusting people. And now she was targeting my son with the same tactics she'd used on her legal husband. But Marcus also provided me with something invaluable: documentation of Victoria's true identity and evidence of her pattern of deceptive behavior. Armed with the information Marcus had provided, I made the difficult decision to hire a private investigator to conduct a comprehensive background check on the woman calling herself Cassandra. I contacted Reynolds Investigative Services, a firm in Burlington that specialized in background verification and fraud investigation. The lead investigator, Janet Reynolds, had 20 years of experience in law enforcement and came highly recommended by several attorneys in the area. When I met with Janet and explained the situation, she told me that cases like this were more common than most people realized. She'd investigated numerous instances of individuals using false identities to enter into relationships with unsuspecting victims, often with the intention of accessing their financial resources or using their good credit to commit fraud. Janet's preliminary investigation confirmed everything I'd discovered and revealed additional disturbing information about Victoria's history. Using resources available only to licensed investigators, she'd uncovered evidence that Victoria had been involved in similar schemes in at least 3 other states over the past decade. In each case, she'd used a different name and had targeted men who were financially stable and emotionally vulnerable. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Victoria would create an elaborate false identity, complete with fictional family background and career history. She would then identify potential targets through online dating sites, social media, or professional networking events. Once she'd established a relationship, she would gradually manipulate her victims into making financial commitments or legal arrangements that benefited her while leaving them vulnerable to significant losses. In one particularly disturbing case from Arizona, Victoria had convinced a widower to add her name to his bank accounts and property deeds just 3 months after they'd started dating. She'd then disappeared with most of his savings, leaving him financially devastated and unable to recover his losses because he'd voluntarily granted her access to his accounts. Janet also discovered that Victoria had been using multiple identities, simultaneously, maintaining separate lives in different regions of the country. She had at least 4 different social security numbers, multiple driver's licenses issued under various names, and a sophisticated network of mail forwarding services that allowed her to maintain these false identities without detection. The investigation revealed that Victoria's current scheme with Daniel was more elaborate than her previous cons. Rather than simply targeting him for immediate financial gain, she appeared to be planning a long-term fraud that would give her access to his assets while providing her with a permanent new identity. The wedding itself was likely intended to legitimize her false identity and make it more difficult for authorities to pursue charges if her deception was discovered. Janet warned me that confronting Victoria directly could be dangerous, as people involved in this type of fraud often became desperate when exposed and might resort to increasingly reckless behavior. She recommended that I gather as much evidence as possible before revealing what I'd discovered, and that I should consider involving law enforcement to protect Daniel from potential retaliation. Over the next 2 weeks, Janet and I worked together to compile a comprehensive dossier of evidence documenting Victoria's true identity and criminal history. We obtained copies of her marriage certificate to Marcus Thompson, financial records showing her pattern of fraudulent activity, and statements from previous victims who were willing to testify about their experiences with her. The evidence painted a picture of someone who was not just deceptive but potentially dangerous. Victoria had a history of becoming increasingly aggressive when her schemes were threatened, and in one case had made threats against a victim who had attempted to expose her to other potential targets. She'd also shown a willingness to involve innocent third parties in her schemes, using false documents and forged signatures to access resources that didn't belong to her. One of the most disturbing discoveries was evidence that Victoria had been planning her current scheme for much longer than anyone had realized. Janet found records indicating that Victoria had been researching Daniel and our family for months before their supposed chance meeting. She'd gathered detailed information about his financial situation, his work history, and even his personal relationships, suggesting that their romance had been calculated from the very beginning. The investigation also revealed the source of Victoria's expensive lifestyle during her time with Daniel. She'd been using her access to his credit cards and financial information to fund not just wedding preparations, but also a parallel life that included travel, luxury purchases, and payments to unknown individuals who were likely helping her maintain her false identity. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that Victoria had been in regular contact with at least 2 other men during her relationship with Daniel, maintaining romantic relationships with them under different names. She'd been telling each of them that she was planning to marry them, and had been collecting money from all of them for various fabricated emergencies and future plans. As the evidence mounted, I realized that Daniel wasn't just facing heartbreak or financial loss. He was the target of a sophisticated criminal operation that could destroy his credit, his reputation, and potentially his freedom if Victoria decided to implicate him in any of her fraudulent activities. The woman he loved didn't exist, and the woman he was planning to marry was someone who viewed him as nothing more than a source of money and legitimacy for her criminal lifestyle. The hardest part of this discovery process was knowing that I would soon have to destroy my son's happiness in order to save his future. Daniel was deeply in love with someone who didn't exist, and revealing the truth would shatter not just his engagement, but his faith in his own judgment and his ability to trust others. But I also knew that allowing the wedding to proceed would be far more devastating than anything he might experience from learning the truth. Janet advised me to approach the situation carefully, emphasizing that Daniel's reaction to this information could determine not just his own safety, but also whether Victoria would face any consequences for her actions. If Daniel confronted her directly before law enforcement was involved, she might disappear again, leaving him financially devastated and giving her the opportunity to target new victims elsewhere. As I prepared to reveal everything I'd discovered, I knew that the next few days would either save my son's life or permanently damage our relationship. But faced with the choice between protecting Daniel's feelings and protecting his future, there was really no choice at all. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could set him free from the web of deception that threatened to destroy everything he'd worked to build. The weight of everything I'd discovered about Victoria's true identity kept me awake for 3 straight nights. I sat in Robert's old chair by the window, watching the snow fall on our quiet street, trying to find the courage to destroy my son's world in order to save it. The evidence Janet Reynolds had compiled was devastating and irrefutable, but I knew that presenting it to Daniel would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I called my sister Helen in Boston, the only person I trusted to help me navigate this impossible situation. Helen had always been the more pragmatic of the two of us, and her career as a social worker had given her experience dealing with victims of manipulation and fraud. When I explained everything I'd learned about Victoria, Helen's response was immediate and clear. Daniel needed to know the truth, regardless of how much it would hurt him. Helen offered to drive up to Millbrook to be present when I confronted Daniel with the evidence. She pointed out that having a neutral third party there might help Daniel process the information more objectively and would provide emotional support for both of us during what was certain to be a traumatic conversation. We agreed that Helen would arrive on Friday evening and I would ask Daniel to come for dinner on Saturday, ostensibly to discuss some family financial matters. The plan was to present the evidence methodically, starting with the basic identity, discrepancy, and building to the more serious revelations about Victoria's criminal history. Helen suggested that we should have copies of all the documentation ready to give to Daniel, so he could review everything at his own pace and verify the information independently if he chose to do so. But as Saturday approached, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Daniel, and his voice carried a tone of excitement that I hadn't heard since the early days of his relationship with Victoria. He told me that Victoria had surprised him by moving their wedding date up by 6 weeks, claiming that she'd found a cancellation at their preferred venue and wanted to take advantage of the opportunity. The sudden timeline change sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Based on Janet's investigation, I knew that Victoria typically accelerated her schemes when she sensed that her deception might be discovered. The fact that she was pushing for an immediate wedding suggested that she might be aware that someone was investigating her background, or that she had some other urgent reason for wanting to formalize her relationship with Daniel as quickly as possible. Daniel explained that the new wedding date was just 3 weeks away, and that Victoria had been working frantically to compress all their planning into this shortened timeline. She'd told him that they needed to send out new invitations immediately, and that anyone who couldn't attend on short notice simply wasn't meant to be part of their special day. The casual dismissal of longtime friends and family members who might not be able to accommodate such sudden changes was typical of Victoria's manipulative approach to relationships. But what concerned me most was Daniel's description of Victoria's recent behavior. He said she'd been increasingly anxious and had been making mysterious phone calls at all hours. She'd also started talking about the possibility of taking an extended honeymoon, possibly lasting several months, during which they would travel extensively and might even consider relocating permanently to another state. When I tried to suggest that Daniel still come for dinner that weekend to discuss some important family matters, he told me that Victoria had other plans for them. She'd arranged for them to spend the weekend in Burlington, meeting with vendors and finalizing details for the accelerated wedding timeline. When I pressed him about finding time for a serious conversation, Daniel seemed distracted and apologetic, promising that we could talk after the wedding when things settled down. This response revealed how completely Victoria had isolated Daniel from his support system. She'd created a sense of urgency around the wedding preparations that made it seem unreasonable for him to prioritize anything else, including his relationship with me. Her control over his schedule and priorities was so complete that he couldn't even recognize how manipulative her behavior had become. Realizing that I couldn't wait for a perfect opportunity to present my evidence, I made the difficult decision to drive to Daniel's apartment unannounced on Sunday morning. I brought Helen with me, along with a folder containing copies of all the documentation Janet had compiled. We arrived at 8:30, hoping to catch Daniel before he left for whatever activities Victoria had planned for the day. When Daniel answered the door, he was clearly surprised to see us but welcomed us warmly. Victoria emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, and I immediately noticed a change in her demeanor. She seemed tense and guarded, and her usual charming smile appeared forced. When I explained that I needed to discuss some urgent family business with Daniel, Victoria quickly interjected that they had appointments all day and couldn't spare the time for a lengthy conversation. I looked directly at Victoria and said that what I needed to discuss concerned her as well, and that it was important enough to warrant postponing their other plans. Her reaction was immediate and telling. The color drained from her face, and she exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before saying that she couldn't imagine what family business would concern her. Helen stepped forward and introduced herself, explaining that she was a social worker with experience in fraud investigation and that she was there to provide professional perspective on some concerning information we'd discovered. Victoria's response was sharp and defensive, asking why we would need a fraud investigator's opinion about anything related to their wedding. That's when I decided to be direct. I told Daniel that the woman he knew as Cassandra was actually named Victoria Chen, that she was already legally married to another man, and that she had a documented history of using false identities to defraud multiple victims across several states. The silence that followed was deafening, and I watched as Daniel's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and growing alarm. Victoria's reaction to my accusation was swift and calculated. Instead of denying the charges or attempting to explain the discrepancies, she immediately went on the offensive. She accused me of being a possessive mother who couldn't accept that my son had found happiness, and she suggested that I'd fabricated the entire story because I couldn't bear to lose control over Daniel's life. But Helen was prepared for this response. She calmly pulled out copies of Victoria's marriage certificate to Marcus Thompson, along with photographs from their wedding ceremony that clearly showed Victoria in a wedding dress, exchanging vows with another man. She also presented copies of the missing person report that Marcus had filed when Victoria disappeared, as well as statements from previous victims describing their experiences with her. Daniel's hands shook as he examined the documents. He stared at the wedding photographs for a long time, comparing them to recent pictures of Victoria on his phone. When he looked up at the woman he'd been planning to marry, his voice was barely above a whisper as he asked if the documents were real. Victoria's response was a masterclass in manipulation. She began crying, claiming that she'd been forced into an abusive marriage with Marcus and had fled for her own safety. She said she'd been too traumatized to discuss her past with Daniel and had used a different name to protect herself from her dangerous ex-husband. She begged Daniel not to believe what she called lies and distortions designed to destroy their happiness. For a moment, I could see Daniel wavering. Victoria's performance was convincing, and his love for her made him want to believe her explanation. But Helen had anticipated this response as well. She presented additional evidence that contradicted Victoria's claims about abuse, including social media posts from the early years of her marriage to Marcus that showed her appearing happy and content. Helen also revealed information about Victoria's other concurrent relationships, showing Daniel evidence that Victoria had been engaged to at least 2 other men during the time she'd been with him. The phone records and financial documentation painted a picture of someone who was systematically deceiving multiple victims simultaneously, using each relationship to fund her lifestyle while preparing to disappear when the deception became unsustainable. The breaking point came when Helen showed Daniel copies of text messages that Victoria had sent to one of her other victims, describing Daniel as a reliable source of funding and discussing her plans to clean out his accounts. After the wedding, Victoria had been laughing about Daniel's devotion and had referred to him as pathetically easy to manipulate. As Daniel read these messages, I watched the last of his illusions crumble. The woman he'd loved and trusted had never seen him as anything more than a source of money and legitimacy for her criminal activities. Everything about their relationship had been a carefully constructed lie, designed to exploit his kindness and vulnerability for her own gain. Realizing that her manipulation tactics were no longer working, Victoria's demeanor underwent a dramatic transformation. The tears and pleading were replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled rage. She accused Daniel of being weak and gullible, saying that he deserved to be taken advantage of because he was too stupid to recognize obvious deception. Victoria then revealed information about Daniel's personal life that she could only have obtained through systematic spying and investigation. She knew details about his financial accounts, his work projects, and even private conversations he'd had with friends and colleagues. It became clear that she'd been monitoring his activities far more extensively than any of us had realized. The situation escalated when Victoria announced that the wedding would proceed as planned, regardless of what we'd discovered about her past. She claimed that Daniel had made legal and financial commitments that he couldn't simply walk away from, and that she would pursue legal action if he attempted to cancel their arrangement. Her use of the word arrangement instead of marriage was telling, revealing how she really viewed their relationship. Victoria also made veiled threats about the consequences of exposing her identity to others. She suggested that doing so would result in unpleasant complications for our family, and hinted that she had information about our personal affairs that could be damaging if made public. The implication was clear. She was prepared to retaliate against anyone who interfered with her plans. When Daniel finally found his voice, he told Victoria that their engagement was over and asked her to leave his apartment immediately. Her response was chilling. She laughed and said that ending their relationship wouldn't be as simple as he imagined, and that she'd invested too much time and effort in their project to walk away empty-handed. Victoria then revealed that she'd already made significant financial transactions using Daniel's accounts and credit cards, including deposits on various wedding vendors and a substantial transfer to an account she controlled. She'd also forged his signature on several documents, including a loan application for $50,000 that had been approved based on his credit history. The full scope of Victoria's financial manipulation was staggering. She'd systematically gained access to every aspect of Daniel's financial life, from his checking accounts to his retirement savings. She'd used his identity to open new credit lines, make large purchases, and even invest in financial instruments that would mature after their planned wedding date. When Daniel demanded that she reverse these transactions and return his money, Victoria's response was coldly practical. She explained that the money had already been distributed among various accounts and investments, making it impossible to recover quickly. She suggested that attempting to pursue legal action would be more expensive and time-consuming than simply accepting the losses and moving on. But Victoria's most shocking revelation came when she casually mentioned that Daniel wasn't her only current victim. She told us that she'd been maintaining similar relationships with 3 other men simultaneously, each of whom believed they were her only romantic partner. She'd been collecting money from all of them for various fabricated emergencies and future plans, using the same sophisticated manipulation techniques that had worked so effectively on Daniel. The other victims included a recently divorced businessman in Boston who'd been funding what he believed were Victoria's medical treatments for a fictional illness. There was also a retired military officer in New Hampshire who'd been supporting her supposed efforts to start a nonprofit organization for veterans. Most disturbing was her relationship with a widower in Maine who'd given her access to his late wife's life insurance money, believing he was helping his future bride start their new life together. Victoria spoke about these other relationships with casual cruelty, describing her victims as assets to be managed rather than human beings whose lives she was destroying. She seemed particularly proud of her ability to maintain multiple identities and keep each relationship separate from the others, viewing it as evidence of her superior intelligence and organizational skills. When I asked why she was revealing all of this information, Victoria's answer was chilling. She said that since her relationship with Daniel was clearly over, she no longer needed to pretend to be the person he'd fallen in love with. She was showing us her true self, and she wanted us to understand exactly what kind of person we'd been dealing with all along. Victoria also revealed that she'd been documenting our family's personal information throughout her relationship with Daniel. She'd photographed financial documents, recorded private conversations, and even installed monitoring software on Daniel's computer and phone. This surveillance had given her detailed knowledge of our family's assets, relationships, and vulnerabilities that she could potentially use against us in the future. Despite everything that had been revealed, Victoria wasn't finished with her manipulation. Over the next few days, she launched a campaign to salvage what she could from her failed scheme. She contacted several of Daniel's friends and colleagues, telling them that I had become obsessively controlling and was spreading malicious lies to destroy their relationship. Victoria's version of events painted her as the victim of a vindictive future mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's happiness. She claimed that I'd hired investigators to fabricate evidence against her because I was jealous of their love and wanted to maintain control over Daniel's life. Her performance was so convincing that some of Daniel's friends began questioning whether my evidence was legitimate. The situation reached a crisis point when Victoria announced that she was proceeding with the wedding as planned, despite Daniel's attempts to cancel the engagement. She'd already sent out new invitations to a smaller group of guests, claiming that they'd decided to have a more intimate ceremony. She'd also informed the vendors that the wedding was still happening, and that any attempts to cancel services would result in legal action. Victoria's most manipulative move was her decision to ban me from attending the wedding rehearsal and ceremony. She sent Daniel an ultimatum. He could either stand up to his controlling mother and proceed with their wedding as planned, or he could choose to remain under my toxic influence and lose the love of his life forever. She framed this as a test of Daniel's commitment to their relationship and his willingness to establish boundaries with his family. Victoria claimed that my interference had created an impossible situation, and that the only way forward was for Daniel to demonstrate his loyalty by excluding me from their wedding celebration. The rehearsal dinner invitation list was carefully curated to include only people who hadn't been exposed to the evidence of Victoria's deception. She'd managed to convince several guests that I'd become irrationally opposed to their marriage and that my false accusations were a desperate attempt to sabotage their happiness. Daniel found himself caught between his love for someone he was still struggling to accept had betrayed him, and his knowledge that everything he'd learned about Victoria was true. Victoria's ultimatum forced him to choose between attending a wedding he knew was based on lies, or facing the social embarrassment of admitting that he'd been systematically deceived by someone he'd trusted completely. The rehearsal was scheduled for the following Friday at St. Catherine's Cathedral, the same church where Daniel had been baptized and where his father's funeral had been held. Victoria's choice of venue was particularly cruel, as she knew how much the church meant to our family and how painful it would be for me to be excluded from such an important event in that sacred space. But Victoria had made a critical error in her calculations. She assumed that banning me from the rehearsal would eliminate the threat I posed to her scheme. What she didn't realize was that I had no intention of honoring her prohibition, and that I'd already made contact with Father Morrison, the priest, who would be performing the ceremony. I'd known Father Morrison for over 20 years, since Daniel was in middle school and had served as an altar boy. Father Morrison had officiated at Robert's funeral and had been a source of comfort and guidance during some of our family's most difficult times. When I called him to discuss some concerns about Daniel's upcoming wedding, he was immediately receptive to hearing what I had to say. During our private meeting in the church rectory, I presented Father Morrison with copies of all the evidence Janet Reynolds had compiled about Victoria's true identity and criminal history. I showed him the marriage certificate proving that Victoria was already legally married to Marcus Thompson, along with documentation of her pattern of fraud and deception across multiple states. Father Morrison was shocked by the revelations, but his experience as a spiritual counselor had taught him to recognize the signs of manipulation and abuse. He'd seen situations where vulnerable individuals had been targeted by predators who used romantic relationships to exploit their victims financially and emotionally. What concerned him most was the possibility that allowing the ceremony to proceed would make the church complicit in facilitating what amounted to bigamy and fraud. After reviewing all the evidence, Father Morrison agreed that he couldn't in good conscience perform a wedding ceremony for someone who was already legally married to another person. He also expressed concern about the broader implications of Victoria's deception and the potential harm she might cause to other members of the congregation if her scheme succeeded. We discussed the best way to handle the situation, recognizing that simply canceling the ceremony without explanation might not be sufficient to protect Daniel or expose Victoria's criminal behavior to authorities. Father Morrison suggested that the rehearsal itself might provide an opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that would make denial impossible and ensure that all the witnesses understood exactly what had been happening. Father Morrison also revealed that Victoria had behaved strangely during their pre-marriage counseling sessions. She'd been evasive about her religious background, had seemed uncomfortable discussing the spiritual aspects of marriage, and had frequently tried to steer conversations toward logistical details rather than the deeper meaning of the commitment she was supposedly making. Most telling was Victoria's reaction when Father Morrison had asked about her family's involvement in the wedding planning. She'd claimed that her parents were too ill to travel, but her body language and tone had suggested that she was lying. Father Morrison's years of experience counseling couples had taught him to recognize when someone was being deceptive about their personal history. The final element of our plan involved coordinating with Janet Reynolds and local law enforcement to ensure that Victoria's criminal activity was properly documented and reported. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Vermont State Police had been investigating reports of identity fraud in the region, and she was very interested in the evidence we'd compiled about Victoria's activities. Detective Martinez explained that cases like Victoria's were increasingly common, with sophisticated criminals using romantic relationships to gain access to their victims' financial resources and personal information. The evidence we'd gathered would be crucial for building a case that could not only protect Daniel, but also prevent Victoria from targeting other victims in the future. As the rehearsal date approached, Daniel remained torn between his rational understanding of Victoria's deception and his emotional difficulty in accepting that everything he'd believed about their relationship had been a lie. Victoria continued to manipulate his confusion, alternating between apologies for her past mistakes and threats about the consequences of canceling their arrangement. But the stage was now set for a confrontation that would either free Daniel from Victoria's manipulation once and for all, or allow her to complete her fraudulent scheme and disappear with whatever she could steal from our family. Victoria had no idea that her ban on my attendance at the rehearsal was about to backfire spectacularly, and that the truth she'd worked so hard to conceal was about to be revealed in the most public way possible. Friday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the March air feel almost spring-like. I woke before dawn, my mind racing through the events that would unfold later that day. The rehearsal was scheduled for 4 o'clock, followed by the dinner at Millbrook's finest restaurant, the Heritage Inn. Victoria had orchestrated every detail to present the image of a perfect, sophisticated celebration, but she had no idea that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble in the most public way imaginable. I spent the morning in my kitchen, making Daniel's favorite blueberry muffins, a ritual that had always calmed my nerves during difficult times. As I measured flour and stirred batter, I thought about all the breakfasts I'd made for my son over the years, all the times this kitchen had been filled with his laughter and the sound of his voice sharing the details of his day. Victoria had tried to steal not just his money and his future, but these precious memories and traditions that defined our family. At 10:30, Detective Sarah Martinez called to confirm that everything was in place for the afternoon's confrontation. She'd coordinated with Father Morrison to ensure that the revelation would be handled in a way that protected everyone's safety while maximizing the legal impact. Detective Martinez had also been in contact with law enforcement agencies in the other states where Victoria had committed similar crimes, and they were prepared to move quickly once her true identity was confirmed publicly. The detective explained that Victoria's pattern was to disappear immediately when her schemes were exposed, often within hours of the confrontation. She would typically have multiple escape routes planned and would use her various false identities to evade capture. The rehearsal represented our best opportunity to expose her crimes in a setting where she couldn't simply vanish without consequences. Father Morrison called shortly after Detective Martinez, his voice carrying a mixture of determination and sadness. He'd spent the morning in prayer, seeking guidance about the difficult situation he was about to navigate. As a priest, he was committed to truth and justice, but he was also deeply concerned about the pain that Daniel would experience when Victoria's deception was fully revealed. He assured me that he would handle the situation with as much compassion as possible while ensuring that the truth could not be denied or dismissed. Helen arrived at noon, bringing lunch and moral support for what she knew would be one of the most difficult days of my life. We sat in the living room where Daniel had spent countless hours as a child, playing with toys and watching cartoons, and I couldn't help but think about how different his life might have been if Victoria had succeeded in her scheme. Helen reminded me that protecting Daniel, even if it meant causing him temporary pain, was the most loving thing I could do as his mother. As the afternoon approached, I changed into the navy blue dress I'd planned to wear to Daniel's wedding, an outfit I'd chosen months earlier when I still believed his bride-to-be was the wonderful woman she'd pretended to be. Looking at myself in the mirror, I thought about all the family celebrations that had taken place in St. Catherine's Cathedral over the years, and how wrong it felt that such a sacred space was being used as the setting for Victoria's elaborate deception. At 3:15, Helen and I drove to the church, parking across the street where we could observe the arriving guests without being seen. Victoria had invited about 30 people to the rehearsal, mostly Daniel's friends and colleagues, who hadn't been exposed to the evidence of her criminal background. As we watched them file into the cathedral, laughing and chatting excitedly about the upcoming celebration, I felt sick knowing that they had no idea they were about to witness the destruction of everything they thought they knew about the bride-to-be. Exactly 4 o'clock. I watched Victoria arrive at the cathedral in a white sedan that I'd never seen before. She was wearing an elegant cream-colored dress and carrying a bouquet of white roses, looking every inch the radiant bride-to-be. Daniel followed closely behind in his father's vintage Buick, and even from across the street, I could see the tension in his shoulders and the uncertainty in his movements. Father Morrison had positioned himself at the main entrance to greet the arriving guests, and I could see him watching Victoria carefully as she approached. Their interaction was brief, but telling. Victoria's usual charm seemed forced, and Father Morrison's responses were polite but notably cooler than his typical warmth. As the bride and groom entered the cathedral together, Father Morrison caught my eye across the street and nodded almost imperceptibly. Helen and I waited 15 minutes before approaching the church, giving everyone time to settle into their positions for the rehearsal. Detective Martinez had arranged for 2 plainclothes officers to be present among the guests, posing as friends of Daniel's from college. They would be ready to intervene if Victoria became violent or attempted to flee when her deception was exposed. As we slipped into the back of the cathedral through a side entrance, I could see the wedding party assembled at the altar. Victoria stood beside Daniel, her hand resting possessively on his arm. While Father Morrison explained the order of the ceremony, the scene looked picture-perfect, exactly the kind of elegant celebration that Victoria had insisted was necessary to reflect their sophisticated lifestyle. But I could also see the signs of tension that the other guests were missing. Daniel's smile seemed forced, and he avoided making eye contact with Victoria for extended periods. Several times during Father Morrison's instructions, Victoria would lean close to Daniel and whisper something that would make him visibly uncomfortable. Her behavior suggested that she was still trying to manipulate him, even as the rehearsal proceeded. The maid of honor was a woman I'd never met, someone Victoria claimed was her closest friend from college. But when I observed their interaction, it was clear that they barely knew each other. The woman seemed confused by Victoria's references to shared memories and experiences, and at one point, she had to ask Victoria to remind her of the correct pronunciation of her name. This small detail reinforced my understanding of how completely fabricated Victoria's entire persona had become. Father Morrison began the rehearsal by explaining the significance of the marriage ceremony and the commitment that the couple was preparing to make. His words carried extra weight, given what he knew about Victoria's existing marriage to Marcus Thompson, and I could see that he was choosing his language carefully to emphasize the importance of honesty and faithfulness in marriage. As the rehearsal progressed, Victoria became increasingly agitated. She interrupted Father Morrison several times to suggest changes to the ceremony, claiming that certain traditional elements wouldn't photograph well or didn't fit with her vision of their celebration. Her behavior was becoming more demanding and less charming, and I could see some of the guests beginning to notice her inappropriate attitude toward the priest. The turning point came when Father Morrison asked if there were any family members present who wanted to offer prayers or blessings for the couple. Victoria quickly announced that both her parents were too ill to attend, and that she preferred to keep the ceremony focused on the couple rather than extended family traditions. Her dismissive tone when discussing family involvement was so cold that several guests exchanged surprised glances. Father Morrison paused the rehearsal and asked if he could speak privately with the bride and groom before proceeding. Victoria immediately became defensive, asking why such a conversation was necessary since they'd already completed their pre-marriage counseling sessions. Father Morrison explained that some new information had come to light that needed to be addressed before the ceremony could continue. Daniel looked confused and concerned, while Victoria's expression shifted from annoyance to barely concealed panic. She attempted to dismiss Father Morrison's request, saying that they had a strict timeline for the rehearsal and dinner, and that any additional discussions could wait until after the wedding. Her insistence on proceeding without delay was telling, and I could see that several guests were beginning to sense that something was wrong. But Father Morrison stood firm, explaining that, as the officiant, he had both a legal and moral obligation to ensure that the ceremony he was about to perform was legitimate and appropriate. He asked the wedding party and guests to remain seated while he spoke with the couple, and then gestured for Daniel and Victoria to follow him to the church office behind the altar. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. As soon as the 3 of them disappeared from view, I stood up from my position in the back pew and began walking toward the front of the church. Helen followed close behind, carrying the folder of evidence that would soon change everything. The guests watched with curiosity as we approached, clearly wondering who we were and why we were interrupting the rehearsal. Through the partially open door of the church office, I could hear Victoria's voice rising in anger as Father Morrison presented her with copies of her marriage certificate to Marcus Thompson. She was denying everything, claiming that the documents were forgeries designed to sabotage her wedding. But when Father Morrison asked her to explain how investigators had obtained photographs of her wedding ceremony in California, her denials became increasingly frantic and illogical. Daniel's voice was barely audible, but I could hear him asking Victoria to explain the discrepancies in her story. He wanted to understand how the woman he loved could have been married to another man while planning their wedding. Victoria's response was to accuse him of believing lies over his commitment to their relationship, and to demand that he choose between her and the people who were trying to destroy their happiness. The conversation in the office was becoming increasingly heated, with Victoria's true personality emerging as her desperation grew. She was no longer the charming, sophisticated woman that Daniel's friends knew. Instead, she was revealing herself to be someone capable of manipulation, deception, and potentially violence when cornered. Father Morrison emerged from the office first, his face grave but determined. He approached the altar and asked for everyone's attention, explaining that he had important information to share before the rehearsal could continue. The guests fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Victoria appeared, in the doorway behind Father Morrison, her face flushed with anger and her carefully styled hair beginning to come undone. She was clutching her purse tightly, and I could see that she was scanning the room, looking for the quickest exit. Daniel followed, looking shell-shocked and confused, as if he still couldn't fully process what he'd just learned. Father Morrison's voice carried throughout the cathedral as he began to speak. He explained that he'd received credible evidence that the bride was already legally married to another man, making the planned ceremony invalid and potentially illegal. He stated that as a priest and an officer of the state, he could not perform a wedding ceremony for someone who was already married. The reaction from the guests was immediate and dramatic. Some gasped in shock, others began talking among themselves, and several people stood up to get a better view of what was happening. Victoria's carefully selected audience was witnessing the complete destruction of the image she'd worked so hard to create. Victoria's response was swift and vicious. She accused Father Morrison of being part of a conspiracy to destroy her happiness, claiming that jealous family members had fabricated evidence to sabotage her wedding. She pointed directly at me, telling the assembled guests that I was a controlling mother who couldn't accept her son's choice of bride. But Father Morrison was prepared for this reaction. He calmly presented copies of the marriage certificate and wedding photographs to several of the guests, allowing them to examine the evidence for themselves. The photographs were particularly damning, showing Victoria in a wedding dress, exchanging vows with Marcus Thompson in what was clearly a legitimate ceremony. As the evidence circulated among the guests, Victoria's denials became increasingly desperate and incoherent. She claimed that the marriage to Marcus had been annulled, then changed her story to say it had been a fake ceremony for immigration purposes. Each new explanation contradicted her previous claims, making it obvious that she was fabricating her responses on the spot. Detective Martinez chose this moment to reveal her presence, showing her badge and explaining that Victoria was under investigation for fraud and identity theft in multiple states. The detective's calm, professional demeanor provided a stark contrast to Victoria's increasingly frantic behavior, and the guests began to understand that they were witnessing not just a canceled wedding, but the exposure of serious criminal activity. Victoria's reaction to the detective's appearance was telling. Instead of expressing surprise or confusion, she immediately became belligerent and defensive, demanding to see warrants and threatening legal action. Her response suggested that she'd been expecting law enforcement involvement and had prepared arguments to delay or complicate any investigation. Detective Martinez began reading from a prepared statement that outlined the scope of Victoria's criminal activity. She explained that the woman they knew as Cassandra was actually Victoria Chen, and that she was wanted for questioning in connection with fraud cases in California, Arizona, and New Hampshire. The detective also revealed that Victoria had been simultaneously engaged to multiple men, collecting money from each of them for fabricated emergencies and future plans. The most shocking revelation came when Detective Martinez disclosed that Victoria had been monitoring Daniel's communications and had installed surveillance software on his electronic devices. She'd been using this information not just to manipulate their relationship, but also to gather intelligence about our family's financial situation and personal affairs. The violation of privacy was staggering, and I could see Daniel's face growing, pale as he realized the extent of Victoria's deception. Father Morrison then revealed additional information that he'd discovered during his investigation of Victoria's background. He explained that she'd attempted to use the church's ceremony as a way to legitimize her false identity, planning to use the marriage certificate as documentation for various financial and legal transactions. The church had unwittingly been selected as a tool in her elaborate fraud scheme. Victoria's facade finally cracked completely when Detective Martinez announced that Marcus Thompson, her legal husband, was present in the cathedral and wanted to speak with her. I turned to see Marcus entering through the main doors, accompanied by another plainclothes officer. His presence was the final piece of evidence that made Victoria's deception undeniable. Marcus's appearance at the cathedral was devastating for Victoria's remaining credibility. Here was a man who could personally testify to her true identity and her pattern of deceptive behavior. When he approached the altar area, Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. She began screaming at him, accusing him of ruining her life and demanding that he leave immediately. But Marcus remained calm, explaining to the assembled guests that Victoria had disappeared from their home 6 months earlier, taking their savings, and leaving him with significant debt from credit cards she'd opened without his knowledge. He'd been searching for her ever since, not to reconcile but to seek justice for the financial damage she'd caused to his life. The contrast between Marcus's quiet dignity and Victoria's increasingly hysterical behavior was stark. The guests could see for themselves which person was telling the truth and which was desperately trying to maintain a lie that had become impossible to sustain. Victoria's carefully constructed image of sophistication and respectability was completely destroyed. Daniel's reaction throughout this revelation was heartbreaking to watch. I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd loved with the criminal who was being exposed before his eyes. He kept looking back and forth between Victoria and the evidence being presented, as if he still hoped there might be some innocent explanation for everything that was being revealed. Victoria made one final attempt to salvage her scheme by appealing directly to Daniel's emotions. She claimed that everything she'd done had been motivated by her love for him and her desire to create a perfect life together. She begged him to ignore the evidence and trust their relationship instead of believing what she called lies designed to separate them. But Daniel had heard enough. In a voice that was barely above a whisper, he told Victoria that their engagement was over and asked her to leave the church immediately. His quiet devastation was more powerful than any angry outburst could have. Ben, and even some of Victoria's supporters among the guests, began to understand the depth of the betrayal he was experiencing. Victoria's response to Daniel's rejection was swift and vindictive. She announced that she had no intention of simply walking away from the situation and that everyone present would face consequences for their role in destroying her plans. She claimed to have compromising information about several of the guests and threatened to use it if they didn't support her version of events. Detective Martinez immediately moved to control the situation, explaining that Victoria was not free to leave until she'd been formally questioned about the fraud allegations. The detective's professional intervention prevented what could have become a dangerous confrontation, as Victoria's behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable and aggressive. As Victoria was escorted toward the church office for questioning, she made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. She called out to Daniel, claiming that she was pregnant with his child and that he was abandoning his family. But this lie was immediately exposed when Detective Martinez revealed that Victoria had used the same false pregnancy claim with at least 2 of her other victims. The guests began filing out of the cathedral in stunned silence, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief at what they'd witnessed. Several of Daniel's friends approached him to offer support and to apologize for not recognizing the signs of Victoria's deception. The community of people who cared about Daniel was rallying around him, providing the emotional support he would need to recover from this betrayal. Father Morrison announced that the church would be conducting a thorough review of their pre-marriage counseling procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. He also offered to provide spiritual counseling for Daniel and anyone else who had been affected by Victoria's deception. The church's response demonstrated their commitment to protecting their congregation from predators who might try to exploit their trust and goodwill. As Victoria was led away for questioning, she continued to maintain her innocence and to threaten retaliation against everyone who had exposed her crimes. But her threats carried no weight now that her true identity and criminal history had been revealed. The sophisticated, charming woman who had captivated Daniel was gone, replaced by someone whose desperation and malice were obvious to everyone present. Daniel stood at the altar where he'd expected to rehearse his wedding vows, surrounded by the evidence of the most elaborate deception any of us had ever encountered. The pain in his eyes was devastating, but I could also see relief beginning to emerge as he realized how close he'd come to destroying his life by marrying someone who had never loved him at all. The silence that filled St. Catherine's Cathedral after Victoria was escorted away was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy with the weight of shattered illusions and broken trust. Daniel stood motionless at the altar, staring at the spot where his future bride had been standing just moments before. The contrast between the beautiful, sacred space and the ugliness of what had just been revealed felt almost surreal. Father Morrison was the first to break the silence, approaching Daniel with the gentle compassion that had made him such a beloved figure in our community for over 2 decades. He placed a hand on my son's shoulder and spoke quietly, offering words of comfort that I couldn't hear but could see were desperately needed. Daniel's shoulders began to shake, and I realized he was finally allowing himself to feel the full impact of what had happened. I wanted to rush to my son immediately, but Helen wisely held me back, reminding me that Daniel needed a moment to process everything before dealing with family emotions. She was right, of course. The revelation that the woman he'd planned to marry was a criminal who had never loved him at all was devastating enough without the added pressure of having to manage my feelings as well. The remaining wedding guests were filing out of the cathedral. In small groups, their voices hushed as they tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed. I could hear fragments of their conversations as they passed, expressions of shock and disbelief mixed with concern for Daniel's well-being. Several of his longtime friends lingered near the altar, clearly wanting to offer support, but unsure how to approach such an unprecedented situation. Detective Martinez emerged from the church office where she'd been questioning Victoria, her expression professional but grim. She approached me first, explaining that Victoria had refused to answer most questions and had demanded legal representation. However, the detective had enough evidence to hold her on multiple charges, including fraud, identity theft, and bigamy. The investigation would continue, but Victoria wouldn't be going anywhere for quite some time. The detective also revealed something that chilled me to the bone. During the brief questioning, Victoria had made veiled threats about unfinished business with our family. She'd suggested that her arrest wouldn't end the consequences of our interference with her plans. Detective Martinez assured me that these threats would be taken seriously and that additional charges might be filed depending on Victoria's future behavior. Marcus Thompson approached our small group, his face etched with a mixture of relief and sadness. He thanked me for exposing Victoria's latest scheme and apologized for not finding her sooner. Marcus explained that he'd been working with law enforcement for months, trying to track Victoria's movements and warn potential victims. Our investigation had provided the breakthrough they needed to finally stop her criminal activities. But Marcus also shared disturbing information about Victoria's psychological state. During their marriage, She'd become increasingly unstable when her deceptions were challenged. She'd made threats against neighbors who questioned her stories, had engaged in stalking behavior toward people she perceived as enemies, and had shown a complete lack of empathy for the people she'd harmed. Marcus warned us to be careful, as Victoria's arrest might make her more dangerous rather than less. 20 minutes after Victoria's arrest, Daniel finally moved from his position at the altar. He walked slowly toward the back of the cathedral, his steps uncertain and his face pale with shock. When he reached me, he collapsed into my arms like he had as a small child, and I felt his entire body shaking with the force of emotions he'd been holding back. For several minutes, Daniel couldn't speak. He just held on to me while tears streamed down his face, grieving not just for the relationship he'd lost, but for the person he'd believed Victoria to be. The woman he'd loved had never existed, and the betrayal went far deeper than simple romantic disappointment. His ability to trust his own judgment had been shattered, along with his faith in the possibility of finding genuine love. When Daniel finally found his voice, his first words were an apology. He said he was sorry for not listening to my concerns, for defending Victoria when I'd tried to warn him, and for allowing her to manipulate him into excluding me from their wedding plans. The guilt in his voice was heartbreaking, but I quickly assured him that he had nothing to apologize for. Victoria was a professional manipulator who had spent months studying his vulnerabilities and exploiting them with sophisticated psychological techniques. Daniel's questions came in a torrent once he started talking. How long had I known about Victoria's deception? Why hadn't I told him sooner? How many of his friends and colleagues knew the truth? Was there anything about their relationship that had been real? Each question revealed another layer of the psychological damage that Victoria's manipulation had caused, and I realized that Daniel's recovery would take much longer than any of us had anticipated. Helen, with her professional experience counseling victims of manipulation and abuse, stepped in to help Daniel understand what had happened to him. She explained that people like Victoria were experts at identifying individuals who were emotionally vulnerable and psychologically accessible. Daniel's kindness, generosity, and recent grief over his father's death had made him an ideal target for someone skilled in exploiting those qualities for personal gain. Father Morrison joined our conversation, offering his perspective as someone who had counseled many couples through difficult situations. He assured Daniel that his capacity for love and trust, while temporarily damaged, was not permanently broken. The experience with Victoria had been traumatic, but it didn't define Daniel's worth as a person or his ability to form healthy relationships in the future. But Daniel's most devastating realization was how completely Victoria had isolated him from the people who truly cared about him. He began listing the friends he'd stopped seeing, the family traditions he'd abandoned, and the personal interests he'd given up because Victoria had convinced him they were incompatible with their sophisticated lifestyle. She'd systematically dismantled his support network, leaving him dependent on her for emotional and social fulfillment. The financial implications of Victoria's deception were also becoming clear. Daniel had given her access to multiple credit cards, bank accounts, and investment portfolios. She'd made substantial purchases and transfers that would take months to unravel, and some of the money might never be recovered. Detective Martinez had promised to help with the financial investigation, but the process would be complicated and emotionally draining. Perhaps most disturbing was Daniel's growing awareness of how thoroughly Victoria had been monitoring his life. She'd read his private emails, listened to his phone conversations, and even tracked his movements using apps installed on his devices. The violation of privacy was so complete that Daniel felt like he didn't know what aspects of his life Victoria hadn't invaded and exploited. Over the following weeks, the legal case against Victoria unfolded with a complexity that none of us had anticipated. Detective Martinez kept us informed of the investigation's progress, and each new discovery revealed additional layers of Victoria's criminal enterprise. She hadn't been working alone. She was part of a sophisticated network of individuals who specialized in romance fraud and identity theft. The network operated across multiple states, with each member focusing on different types of victims and different methods of exploitation. Victoria's specialty was targeting recently divorced or widowed men who had significant assets but were emotionally vulnerable due to their personal losses. She would research potential victims extensively before making contact, learning about their interests, their social circles, and their financial situations. Victoria's arrest led to the discovery of a database containing detailed profiles of over 200 potential victims across the United States. The profiles included photographs, financial information, psychological assessments, and even personal details gathered from social media and public records. The sophistication of the operation was staggering, and law enforcement agencies in multiple states began coordinating their investigations. The most shocking revelation was that Victoria had been planning to disappear immediately after her wedding, to Daniel. She'd already established a new identity in another state and had been gradually transferring money to accounts that would be accessible under her new name. The wedding ceremony would have provided her with legal documentation to support her false identity while also giving her access to Daniel's assets as his legal spouse. Marcus Thompson's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. He provided evidence of Victoria's previous crimes and demonstrated the pattern of behavior that she'd used with multiple victims. Marcus had been working with federal investigators for months, documenting Victoria's activities and helping them understand the scope of her criminal network. But the legal proceedings also revealed the personal cost of Victoria's crimes. Other victims came forward to testify about their experiences, and their stories painted a picture of devastating emotional and financial damage. An elderly widower from New Hampshire had lost his entire retirement savings. A divorced father in Arizona had been left unable to pay for his children's college education. The human cost of Victoria's crimes was immeasurable. Daniel was required to testify about his relationship with Victoria and the financial damage she'd caused to his life. Preparing for this testimony was emotionally difficult, as it required him to relive the entire deception and acknowledge how completely he'd been manipulated. However, the process also helped him understand that he wasn't responsible for Victoria's actions and that her ability to deceive him didn't reflect any weakness or failure on his part. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the evidence that Janet Reynolds had compiled during our private investigation. The documentation of Victoria's false identity, her existing marriage to Marcus, and her pattern of deceptive behavior provided crucial support for the criminal charges. Janet's professional investigative work had been instrumental in stopping Victoria's scheme and protecting Daniel from further harm. Victoria's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a victim of circumstances who had been forced into deceptive behavior by abusive relationships and financial desperation. However, the evidence of her sophisticated criminal network and her calculated targeting of vulnerable victims made this defense strategy impossible to sustain. The prosecution was able to demonstrate that Victoria's crimes were premeditated and part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. As the legal proceedings continued, Victoria's psychological evaluation revealed a disturbing lack of empathy and remorse for her victims. She continued to maintain that her actions had been justified and that her victims had been willing participants in relationships that benefited both parties. Her complete inability to recognize the harm she'd caused suggested that she would likely continue her criminal behavior if given the opportunity. The exposure of Victoria's crimes sent shockwaves through our small community of Millbrook. Many residents had met her during Daniel's engagement and had been impressed by her apparent sophistication and success. Learning that she was actually a criminal who had been studying their community for potential targets was deeply unsettling for everyone involved. Father Morrison organized a series of community meetings to discuss the situation and provide information about how to protect against similar schemes in the future. Detective Martinez attended these meetings to educate residents about romance fraud and identity theft, explaining the warning signs that people should watch for when meeting new romantic partners or business associates. The meetings revealed that Victoria hadn't limited her activities to targeting Daniel. She'd been gathering information about other residents, including several elderly widows and divorced men who fit the profile of her typical victims. Her research had been so thorough that she'd identified potential targets throughout the area and had been planning to expand her operations after completing her scheme with Daniel. Local businesses also discovered that Victoria had been using false information to establish credit accounts and make purchases. Several merchants had extended credit to her based on her association with Daniel and our family's reputation in the community. These businesses faced significant losses when Victoria's true identity was revealed and her fraudulent accounts were exposed. The community's response to Daniel's situation was overwhelmingly supportive. Friends and neighbors who had been deceived by Victoria's charm rally around Daniel, offering both emotional support and practical assistance with the financial recovery process. The local bank worked with Daniel to identify and reverse unauthorized transactions, while community members helped him rebuild his credit and restore his financial stability. But the community support extended beyond just practical assistance. People shared their own experiences with manipulation and fraud, helping Daniel understand that he wasn't alone in having been victimized by someone skilled in deception. The shared experience of having been fooled by Victoria created a sense of solidarity that helped everyone involved process their feelings of anger and betrayal. Local law enforcement used the Victoria case as an opportunity to educate the community about protecting personal information and recognizing potential fraud schemes. They organized workshops on cybersecurity, financial protection, and identifying suspicious behavior in both personal and professional relationships. The goal was to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. The case also prompted changes in local business practices. Banks, credit agencies, and merchants implemented stricter verification procedures for new accounts and large transactions. The community learned valuable lessons about the importance of protecting personal information and maintaining healthy skepticism when dealing with people who seemed too good to be true. As months passed, Daniel gradually began to rebuild his social connections and restore his confidence in his ability to form healthy relationships. The process was slow and sometimes painful, but the community's support made it possible for him to move forward without being defined by Victoria's betrayal. He resumed his architectural work, reconnected with old friends, and slowly began to trust his own judgment again. The experience also strengthened the bond between Daniel and me. The crisis had tested our relationship, but ultimately, it had demonstrated the importance of family loyalty and unconditional love. Daniel expressed gratitude for my persistence in investigating Victoria's background, acknowledging that my actions had saved him from a devastating future. Father Morrison continued to provide spiritual counseling for Daniel and other community members affected by Victoria's crimes. The church became a center of healing and support, offering both practical assistance and emotional guidance for people struggling to understand how they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted. Victoria was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, bigamy, and conspiracy charges related to her criminal network. The sentence reflected both the severity of her crimes and the extensive damage she'd caused to multiple victims across several states. Additional civil judgments required her to pay restitution to her victims, though the financial recovery was limited by her lack of legitimate assets. The criminal network that Victoria had been part of was dismantled through coordinated law enforcement efforts across multiple states. Several other members were arrested and prosecuted, leading to significant improvements in how romance fraud and identity theft cases are investigated and prosecuted. Victoria's case became a model for understanding and combating sophisticated fraud schemes that target emotionally vulnerable victims. Marcus Thompson was finally able to obtain a divorce from Victoria and begin rebuilding his financial stability. He relocated to Vermont temporarily to assist with the legal proceedings and formed an unexpected friendship with Daniel. Their shared experience as Victoria's victims created a bond that helped both men process their trauma and move forward with their lives. Janet Reynolds's investigative work on Victoria's case enhanced her reputation as a specialist in fraud investigation. She began working with law enforcement agencies to develop training programs for identifying and investigating romance fraud schemes. Her expertise helped protect other potential victims and improved the overall response to similar crimes. Detective Martinez used the Victoria case to advocate for better resources and training for investigating romance fraud and identity theft. The case demonstrated the need for improved coordination between law enforcement agencies and better support services for victims of sophisticated manipulation schemes. Her work led to significant policy changes that benefited future victims. 2. Years after Victoria's arrest, Daniel met Sarah, a local teacher who shared his interest in community service and sustainable architecture. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the intense pressure and manipulation that had characterized his experience with Victoria. Sarah was kind, genuine, and patient with Daniel's cautious approach to trust and commitment. Daniel and Sarah's engagement was announced quietly, with a small celebration that included only close family and friends. The contrast with Victoria's elaborate wedding plans was striking, but the simplicity and authenticity of Daniel's relationship with Sarah made it clear that he'd learned to value substance over style. Their wedding took place at St. Catherine's Cathedral, with Father Morrison officiating in a ceremony that emphasized love, trust, and commitment. The guest list included many of the same people who had witnessed Victoria's exposure 2 years earlier. But this time, they were celebrating a genuine relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. As I watched Daniel exchange vows with Sarah, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. Victoria's deception had been devastating, but it had also taught our family valuable lessons about the importance of trust, the power of community support, and the resilience of the human spirit when faced with betrayal and manipulation. The experience had changed all of us, but ultimately it had made us stronger and more aware of the precious nature of genuine relationships. Daniel's recovery had been long and difficult, but it had led him to a love that was real, honest, and built on a foundation of mutual trust and respect. Standing in the same cathedral where Victoria's deception had been exposed, I felt grateful for the courage to investigate my suspicions and the community that had supported us through the crisis. Sometimes protecting the people we love requires difficult decisions and painful confrontations, but the alternative is allowing them to be destroyed by those who would exploit their trust and kindness. Victoria's story was one of manipulation and betrayal, but it was also a reminder that truth, no matter how painful, is always preferable to a beautiful lie. Daniel's new beginning with Sarah proved that healing is possible, and that love, when it's real, is worth waiting for and fighting to protect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.